An angry stranger storms into a cafe, pointing a finger at Barron Trump. What unfolds next is a conversation so unexpected it leaves everyone questioning their own assumptions. It was a breezy afternoon in the heart of Philadelphia, with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee wafting from a corner cafe. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and inviting, filled with the sound of chatter and clinking cups. Barron Trump sat at a small table near the window, his tall frame slightly hunched over a thick book. Wearing a plain hoodie and jeans, he blended into the crowd, or so he thought. Barron sought a moment of quiet amidst the bustling cafe. As the youngest son of a former president, his life had often been a whirlwind of public scrutiny. Here, among strangers scrolling through their phones and sipping lattes, he felt a rare sense of anonymity. Engrossed in his book, Barron was startled by a sudden sharp voice cutting through the hum of the cafe. "You think you're better than the rest of us?" The voice was loud and sharp, silencing conversations and drawing all eyes to a man standing a few feet from Barron. The man, appearing to be in his late 40s, had a weathered face and a fiery expression. Though not poorly dressed, his clothes bore the marks of someone who had seen hard times. His stance was confrontational, his tone tense. Barron froze, not in fear but surprise. This was not the quiet afternoon he had anticipated. The man's voice trembled with anger. "You've had everything handed to you on a silver platter. Do you even know what it's like to struggle?" Other patrons exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to step in or stay silent. Behind the counter, the barista hesitated, her hand hovering near the phone. Barron, in contrast to the man's intensity, remained calm. He closed his book, set it down gently on the table, and looked up. "Kai, sir," he said, his voice steady and quiet. "I'm not sure what's upset you, but maybe we could talk about it." The man scoffed loudly. "Talk? You want to talk? What could you possibly have to say that someone like me would want to hear?" The room fell silent, the air thick with tension. But Barron didn't meet the man's aggression with more aggression. Instead, he did something unexpected. Barron leaned back in his chair, relaxed but attentive, and gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Please, sit," he said calmly, his tone disarming. The offer momentarily caught the man off guard, though his shoulders remained tense. He stood there, fists clenched, glaring down at Barron. "Why would I want to sit with someone like you?" the man sneered. "You're just another spoiled kid who will never know what it's like to live in the real world." Some patrons shifted uncomfortably, whispering to one another. The barista glanced at her phone, weighing whether to intervene. But Barron's composure never wavered, and the unfolding conversation had everyone holding their breath, unsure of where this unusual encounter would lead. "Maybe you're right," Barron admitted, his voice calm and measured. "I haven't walked in your shoes, but if you sit down, maybe you can tell me what that's like." For a moment, the man seemed to falter. The firmness in Barron's tone wasn't a challenge, it was an invitation. Yet instead of taking the offered seat, the man leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a sharp whisper. "You think I owe you my story? You think that'll make you feel better about yourself?" He snapped, sarcasm dripping from every word. Barron's gaze didn't waver. "I think everyone has a story that deserves to be heard," he replied, his words cutting through the silence in the room like a knife. The man hesitated, caught between anger and uncertainty. The cafe's patrons, still watching with rapt attention, seemed to hold their collective breath. The moment stretched on, heavy with unspoken possibilities, until finally, the man grabbed the back of the empty chair. Dragging it noisily across the floor, he sat down, arms crossed defensively, his jaw tight. "Fine," he muttered. "You want to hear about the real world? I'll tell you." The tension in the cafe shifted, still present, but no longer suffocating. The barista quietly lowered her hand from the phone, and the other patrons leaned in slightly, pretending not to eavesdrop, but hanging on every word. Barron nodded, leaning forward just enough to signal his attentiveness. "I'm listening," he said simply. What followed wasn't just a story, it was a revelation. The man took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as though trying to steady himself. When he began to speak, his voice was quieter, but every word was raw and heavy with emotion. You look at me and see someone angry for no reason, but you don't know what it's like to lose everything, he began, bitterness seeping into his tone. His gaze swept around the room, daring anyone to interrupt, before locking back on Barron. I had a job, a family, a decent life. Then the factory I worked at shut down. Just like that. Gone. Hundreds of us left with nothing but empty promises they'd relocate us. Promises that never came true. The cafe was utterly silent, the faint hiss of the espresso machine the only sound. As the man continued, his tough exterior began to crumble. I tried to hold it together for my wife and kids, taking whatever odd jobs I could find, but when you're barely scraping by, it doesn't take much to break you. He paused, his voice cracking. My wife. She left. Took the kids with her. Said she couldn't live like this anymore. He stopped again, his eyes glistening, fighting back tears. I can't even blame her, he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Barron sat silently, his face unreadable, but his eyes filled with empathy. The man's gaze dropped to the table, his fingers tracing its wooden surface as if searching for an anchor. Do you know what it feels like to walk into a room and know everyone is looking at you, judging you, thinking you're nothing? That's my life now, every single day. His words hung heavy in the air, resonating deeply not just with Barron, but with everyone in the room. A woman at a nearby table shifted uncomfortably, suddenly engrossed in her coffee cup, trying to process what she'd just heard. The anger that had initially filled the room was gone, replaced by a somber understanding that left everyone reflecting on their own assumptions. And then I see someone like you, the man continued, his voice rising slightly, sitting here with your fancy clothes, reading a book like you don't have a care in the world. It makes me mad, because no matter what I do, I'll never have what you have. His words hung in the air, heavy and charged, like a storm cloud about to break. Barron didn't rush to respond. He let the man's pain settle, respecting its weight. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. I don't know what it's like to be in your shoes, Barron said softly, but I do know what it's like to feel judged, to feel like people have already decided who you are before you've even said a word. The man looked up sharply, his eyes narrowing. What could you possibly know about that? What came next wasn't what anyone in the cafe expected. Barron's response shifted the conversation and the mood in the room in a way no one could have predicted. Barron took a deep breath, his steady composure making the room's tension feel less suffocating. He leaned in, meeting the man's skeptical glare with unwavering eyes. You might think I've got it easy because of my name, Barron began. And in some ways you're right. I've never had to worry about a roof over my head or food on the table, but that doesn't mean I don't know what it's like to feel misunderstood. His voice was calm, but there was a weight to it that drew everyone in. The man scoffed, ready to interrupt, but Barron raised a hand, not to dismiss, but to ask for a chance to be heard. Everywhere I go, people make assumptions, Barron continued. They think they know who I am, what I believe, and what I've done just because of my last name. They don't see me as a person. They see a caricature, someone they can project their own frustrations onto. Kind of like what's happening here. The man's face twitched, as though Barron's words had struck a nerve. He didn't reply, but his posture shifted slightly, his arms loosening from their defensive cross. Barron went on, his tone genuine and measured. I'm not saying my struggles are the same as yours. They're not. But pain is pain. Feeling like you're invisible, or that you'll never be understood, that's something we all face, no matter where we come from. The cafe was silent now, thick with thought. Even the barista had paused mid-step, her tray of cups momentarily forgotten. Barron leaned back slightly, giving the man space to absorb his words. I'm not here to argue with you, Barron said. I'm not even here to change your mind. I just want to understand, because I think, and maybe, just maybe, we'd be a little kinder to each other if we did. The man's jaw tightened, and for a moment it looked like he might lash out again. But instead, he exhaled sharply, as if releasing something heavy he'd been holding onto for far too long. "You really believe that?" he asked, his voice quieter now, almost unsure. Barron nodded. "I do, and I think maybe deep down you do too. Otherwise, you wouldn't have told me your story." The man blinked, his tough exterior cracking just a little more. He rubbed the back of his neck, his gaze softening ever so slightly as he processed Barron's words, and carried an air of quiet wisdom. Her gray hair was neatly pulled back, and her kind eyes sparkled with curiosity. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice warm but tentative. "I couldn't help but notice what just happened. That was remarkable." Barron glanced up, offering a polite smile. "I didn't really do much," he replied, setting his book down. The woman shook her head. "Oh, but you did. You listened. You let him speak his truth, and you met him with kindness. That's not nothing. That's rare." Barron shrugged lightly. "I think sometimes people just need space to be heard. He did the hard part." The woman smiled, her expression tinged with admiration. "Maybe so, but you reminded us all that there's still good in people, even when it's hard to see." Barron tilted his head thoughtfully, but didn't respond, sensing she wasn't quite finished. "You know," she continued, "I've spent a long time believing people don't change, that we're all just set in our ways. But after today—" She trailed off, glancing toward the door where the man had exited. "Maybe I need to rethink that." Barron chuckled softly. "Change is tricky. It's slow and messy, but sometimes it starts with a single moment, like today." The woman nodded, a faint smile gracing her lips. "Well, thank you for reminding me of that." As she returned to her table, Barron picked up his book again, though he found it hard to focus. The energy in the cafe still hummed, a subtle undercurrent of connection that hadn't been there before. For the rest of the afternoon, patrons lingered just a little longer, their conversations tinged with an unexpected openness. It was as though the room had collectively remembered something important, that kindness, even in small doses, could change the course of a day or a life. And as Barron finally gathered his things and left the cafe, he couldn't help but smile, knowing he had been a part of something special, something real. Glancing around the cafe, the man seemed to notice for the first time how many people were watching him. A flicker of self-consciousness crossed his face, but then he looked back at Barron. "You're not what I expected," he admitted, his tone softer now. But the real surprise wasn't what Barron said next. It was what the man did in response. The man sat back in his chair, his body language shifting from guarded to contemplative. For a long moment, he didn't say anything. The cafe was still, every patron caught in the quiet tension of the moment. Finally, he spoke, his voice stripped of its earlier hostility. "You know, I came in here mad at the world," he said, shaking his head. "Mad at people like you, who I thought had it all handed to them. But maybe I've been carrying that anger too long. Maybe it's not about you at all." Barron didn't respond right away. He let the man's words hang in the air, giving them the weight they deserved. When he finally spoke, his voice was steady and measured. "I think it's easy to blame people we don't know. It's harder to face what's really hurting us. But you did that today, and I respect that." The man looked up, his eyes meeting Barron's for the first time. There was no trace of anger, only a weary kind of gratitude. "You're a good kid," he said, almost reluctantly, as if the admission cost him something. "I don't say that often." The shift in tone was palpable. The tension that had gripped the cafe dissolved, replaced by an unexpected sense of connection. The barista smiled faintly as she resumed her work. A couple at a nearby table exchanged glances, their expressions softening. Then the man did something that caught everyone off guard. He reached across the table, his hand outstretched. Barron hesitated for only a second before clasping it firmly. "I'm sorry," the man said, his voice thick with emotion, "for judging you before I even knew you." Barron smiled, a genuine expression that lit up his face. "And I'm sorry if I ever gave you a reason to feel that way." The handshake lingered for a moment before the man pulled back. He stood, smoothing his shirt awkwardly, and glanced around the cafe. "I think I owe everyone here an apology too," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "I came in here angry, but this kid, he reminded me that sometimes we've just got to listen." The cafe erupted in quiet applause, not loud or showy, but heartfelt. The man nodded, visibly moved, and made his way to the door. He paused just before leaving and looked back at Barron. "Thank you," he said simply, and then he was gone. What happened next wasn't as dramatic, but it left everyone in the cafe with something to think about, a moment they wouldn't soon forget. As the door closed behind the man, the cafe seemed to exhale collectively. Conversation slowly resumed, but it wasn't the same. There was a new energy in the room, a shared understanding among strangers who had just witnessed something extraordinary. Barron returned to his seat, picked up his book, and took a sip of his now cold tea. But before he could fully retreat into his solitude, a woman from a nearby table approached him. She looked to be in her 60s,